walking me through where you were just prior to Nuremberg and what brings you there?
Well, that's fairly easy to do. I was practicing law here in Washington when I read in the newspaper that Robert Jackson had been appointed the chief prosecutor. And I had worked for Robert Jackson in the Department of Justice for a couple of years in the Solicitor General's office. So, in a spirit of enthusiasm, I went down to the Supreme Court and saw Bob, who I'll call him easier, and said, look, I'm curious about this, and I'd be glad to help out in any way I can. I don't want to leave my practice, but if I can be of any assistance to you, well, that would be fine. So he said, fine, that's great. I'd like to have your help. And he gave me copies of the draft of the indictment and copies of the draft of the charter for the court. And he said, we're working on both of these, and I'd welcome any suggestions you could make as to both substance and style and anything else that comes to mind. So I took them along and came back to the office, and I worked on them here and at home. And then I began to realize that this was kind of a funny operation because they were all stamped top secret or whatever, confidential, I guess secret. And I had no reason to see them, and I was carrying them around in my briefcase. So I went back to Bob and I told him that I'm glad to help, but this is going to get me in trouble and probably get him in trouble if I started running around with secret documents without any status. Well, the upshot was that I finally worked out a deal with the commandant of the Coast Guard. There was a organization that may still exist, as far as I know, but it was then, called the Temporary Reserves of the Coast Guard. The temporary reserves were designed to allow people who had boats or yachts or whatever to help the Coast Guard sort of patrol harbors on a pro bono basis, part-time. They had to put in theoretically 12 hours a week. They didn't get paid for it. But while they were doing it, they put on a Coast Guard uniform, and they were members of the Coast Guard for all intents and purposes. And Bob and I worked out a deal whereby I would become a member of the Coast Guard, temporary reserve, and I became a lieutenant commander, actually. Bob intervened with the commandant to get me a fancy rag so that I could be what he wanted me to be, which was his representative here in Washington. So as a member of the Coast Guard Temporary Reserves, I was entitled to see these papers, and I had an office in the Pentagon, had a staff of about 4 people over there, and my function was to be the eyes and ears and assistant to the trial staff, the trial team in Nuremberg for whatever they needed in this part of the world. I'd come into this office. It wasn't here then. It was up on 15th Street. But I come into the office in the morning, do some work, go into the men's room and change into my Coast Guard uniform, take a taxi over to the Pentagon, spend the day over there, come back, change into my regular clothes, sign my letters, check the briefs that I dictated or written, and go home. In the course of that operation, I was in Nuremberg, I think about 4 times. A couple of times just acquaint myself with what was going on over there so I'd be more intelligent in helping out on this end. Wants to take over a couple of witnesses who relocated here in the United States, and miscellaneous things of that sort. I kept in touch with Bob, or the staff over there, with a secure telephone from the Pentagon, and I kept Bob advised as to the press coverage of the trials and what they commented on, things of that sort. And when the trials were over, I disenrolled from the temporary reserve. You don't resign, you're enrolled in the reserves, and you're disenrolled. And when General Taylor was appointed to carry on with the subsequent trials, he asked me if I'd help him out. So for one summer, I took 3.5 or 4 months off, re-enrolled in the Coast Guard as a lieutenant commander, and went over and helped Tell with the prosecution of the ministry's case, and had a real good time. Also, in the course of that earlier time, when the main trial was going on, one of the things that the prosecution in Nuremberg wanted was an affidavit from the ambassador or the consul general in Austria at the time of the Anschluss, a man named Messerschmitt, a former school teacher and a very garrulous young old man. He was ambassador to Mexico at the time, so I went down to Mexico as a Coast Guard officer and got an affidavit from Mr. Messerschmitt in Mexico on his view of the events in Austria at the time of the Anschluss, and sent that over to Nuremberg. In general, that's about my contribution. I had one other contribution, along for covering the whole waterfront. One day early on, at the Pentagon, a professor, what was his name? He'll come to me in a minute. Professor of linguistics at Georgetown University came over and said, "What are they going to do about all the languages you have to worry about?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I haven't any idea what they're going to do." But I knew that the United States had taken the responsibility for the courtroom and the physical facilities and all the rest of it. So he said, "Well, Dostert, Colonel Dostert."
D-O-S-T-E-R.
D-O-S-T-E-R-T. He wasn't a colonel then, but he was a professor Dostert. He said, "Well, I've had some experience with this. I've worked out simultaneous translations for some of the things that have gone on in Europe with 2 languages. So the speaker doesn't have to wait for a translation. It can be done through earphones. And I should think we could do it for 4 languages just as well. It might be a little more difficult to get people, but I think it's feasible." So I called up Bob on the telephone to Nuremberg and said, "Look, I don't know what the score is on this translation business, but here's a man that thinks we can get a simultaneous system. So at least let me explore it a little bit before you make any other firm arrangements about it." So he said, "All right." So we rigged up a mock trial in the Pentagon with somebody who could speak Russian, somebody could speak French, somebody could speak English, somebody could speak German, and earphones. And we got some interpreters. Dostert supplied them. And we ran a sort of a mock trial. It was a pretty sorry performance, but it obviously could work. And I called Bob and said, "This is going to work. Let Dostert take it over, and with the help from the technical companies setting up the wiring and everything else, I think he can provide you with a simultaneous translation which will make the whole trial a hell of a lot easier." Bob said, "Sure it will." So he said, "All right." Dostert took over. And they did have a simultaneous system. I was there early in the trial when the system was first operating. I don't know whether you visualize the courtroom, but up on one side up here were the interpreters behind the glass case so they could see who was talking. And everybody had earphones. And there was a red button in front of each of the principal people, the judges and the prosecutors and whatnot. If the system wasn't working, they could push the red button and everybody would stop talking until they got it straightened out. Well, the first day, the red light was on, off and on all the time, until they really got the machinery really got the swing of it. But I was there a couple of weeks later, and it never came on. The interpreters were fantastically good, and they could handle. They knew, by and large, it wasn't completely catch as catch can, because they knew that the British prosecutor was going to be cross-questioning a German witness or a Czech witness or a Russian witness or whatever, so they could be prepared for the language that was coming up. But they were also prepared if the French judge happened to interpose a question or the Russian judge wanted to say something. And they were fantastic, really, they were fantastic. Later on, when I was there to tell Taylor, I was cross-examining a German, doing a rather, a real cross-examination, not pointing fingers and all that. And I was getting his replies in English and he was getting mine in German. And I looked up at the interpreter who was sitting off to one side, and he was reading a comic book. It was purely mechanical. He wasn't even thinking. I thought, my God, I wonder how people get to be as good as that. But they were really extraordinarily good. And I remember Fritchie, who was one of the defendants, at the time when it was really quite a hassle. I don't remember exactly who was involved, but there were about 5 languages all mixed up at the same time, and it all went right. And Fritchie turned up to the interpreters. Great stuff, great stuff. Well, that's the outline now. I can elaborate a little bit on a few of those things, but you've got pretty much my entire career in the Nuremberg Trial.
My father said if Charlie wants to come to the University of Washington in Seattle, instead of going to the University of Montana, which I had planned to do, I can give him a job parking cars in my garage. So, being offered a job, I went to University of Washington. And I spent 4 years there. In my 4th year, I was teaching quiz sections in political science, which is my major. And one of the professors said, "What are you going to do when you finish here?" And I said, "I'm going to law school." He said, "Where are you going to go?" And I said, "Well, I've got a job, and I'm here." And I said, "Well, I'll go to law school." He said, "Oh, you don't want to do that. You want to go to Harvard." I said, "Well, why Harvard?" He said, "Well, it's the best law school. You ought to go there." "Well, how do I get to Harvard?" I said, "Well, I'll get you the papers." So he got me the application blanks. I filled them out and sent them in, and they wrote back and said you're accepted. So I went to Harvard. When I graduated from Harvard, I was one of Felix Frankfurter's hot dogs. He got me a job clerking for a judge in New York. And I spent the year clerking for Augustus Hand on the Second Circuit. And when I was about to finish that, Gus said, "Where are you going to go?" And I said, "Well, I'm from New York. And I've got some offers from Sullivan and Cromwell and Rude Clark." And I said, "Well, I'll stay here." He said, "Well, I know the Solicitor General. Mine, and I'll glad to introduce you." So he did, and I came down and saw Stanley Reed and started working in the Department of Justice. And when I finished 2 years there, somebody said, "I'd like to have you come over to Covington and Burling," so I came over here, and I've been here ever since.